Oh boy. This, if you couldn't tell, is a long video, so I'm going to do a small little disclaimer and content warning right here before the intro. First off, I'm going to be spoiling the hell out of Stanley Parable, way more than I did in the first video that I talked about these games. That's probably obvious going by the name and the length of the video, but I wanted to outright say it here, right now, before any pants got in a twist. Next, a general content warning. At a couple points in the game, there are themes of depression and suicide. Sometimes it's vaguely alluded to, and other times it's blatantly happening on screen. If you're uncomfortable with any of that, I will be putting up another warning and a timestamp to skip the section where I will be talking about it the most. And if you are suffering with depression or have had suicidal thoughts or have been concerned you might be suffering with them without fully realizing it yourself, please do not use anything I say as a way to self-diagnose or justify any actions you might take. Talk to loved ones and seek professional help if you can. I'd also like to make it clear that this entire video is mostly just my own thoughts and speculation. I'm not the writer of these games. I'm not trying to say this is verbatim what the creator's intended messages are. I'm simply going through all of what I can for these games and all of what I find interesting and giving my own interpretations on them. And if you have a differing view on any of the ideas I bring up today, please share them in the comments. I'd love to discuss these games way more with as many people as I can. But with all that said, get comfortable, get a blanket, get a snack, get a drink, whatever you want. This is like an hour long. Enjoy.
This is the story of a man named Stanley.
The Stanley Parable is very hard to describe. The Steam page says that you will play as Stanley and you will not play as Stanley. You will follow a story, you will not follow a story. You will have a choice, you will have no choice. The game will end, the game will never end. But hopefully without coming off as a pretentious douchebag, I want to say that it's more than just a game. It is a genuine, bona fide piece of art. No other video game, hell, no other story that I can think of has made me laugh, cry, and make me genuinely think about my life, my choices, and if it matters. And today I'm hoping to give a mostly satisfactory justification on why I put it on such a high pedestal. Why I see it as the underappreciated, ahead of its time masterpiece when it feels like not so many do. About a year ago, I made a 20-minute video talking about Ultra Deluxe specifically, but that was mostly in broad strokes as to not spoil too much of the game as I wanted other people to try it out. But as the title of this video says, I don't care about spoilers this time. This is everything I want to say about the Stanley Parable.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
To try and understand everything the Stanley Parable is trying to convey, we need to take a brief look at what many would probably consider the first ending. Now, technically, the freedom ending is not the first ending of the game. There's nothing stopping you from doing any other ending first, but I consider it the first ending because it's most likely the first ending a new player would get. I have no way to know the exact numbers or the statistics of the game to confirm this, but I can say with confidence that most players do it first because they're conditioned to. When playing a story-driven game, sure we may get sidetracked or consider taking other routes, but most of us would be hard-pressed to say we didn't do the main ending on our first playthroughs. Games nudge and encourage us to go for that one first, and then do any alternative endings or side quests on repeat playthroughs, and the Stanley Parable is no different with its encouragement. The freedom ending is the least fourth wall breaking. It's trying to hold up the lie that this is the true ending, that this is what you, player, is supposed to be building up to. But what does it build up to? Not much. The end sort of falls flat, with the story just amounting to Stanley woke up from the mind control, walked all the way to the power switch, turned it off, and left. Of course, we're happy for Stanley getting his freedom, who wouldn't be, but we don't really know the stakes by this point. We don't know what Stanley's regular life is like, we don't know much about Stanley as a person, and it's hard to fully understand Stanley's position in the world with this ending in a vacuum. And the lack of conflict causes this ending to feel somewhat hollow and stilted, like we've only been given the middle part of a story rather than a full 3-act structure, and the game does this intentionally. It wants you to feel dissatisfied with this true ending to push you to try and go against the narrator more. Hell, it doubles down on this by going as far as awarding you an achievement claiming that you completed the game upon getting this ending. Any new players will immediately become suspicious of this, as there's clearly more to this game outside of this one ending, evident by the multiple choices they would have ignored to get here. So knowing that the ending is intentionally pushing you to go against the narrator, what happens if you get them all the way to the end before going against the story? And if the freedom ending is resolution without conflict, what about an ending that has conflict but no resolution? Well, you get the countdown ending, an ending where, upon trying to take over the story and turn the mind control machine back on, the narrator reveals that the entire office is rigged to explode. All the lights and buttons come alive as you're given 2 minutes to try and disarm the nuclear bomb. This sits on nearly the opposite side of the storytelling spectrum to the freedom ending, because no matter what you do, you cannot disarm the bomb. Can't escape. It's physically impossible. Players have even gone as far as to looking into the code of the game and rummaging through the map files to find a secret answer. But there's nothing. And it's brilliant. You're forced into this do-or-die, fight-or-flight mentality that there must be a way to shut it down. This is obviously a test from the game, right? If I die here, I can just try again and again, and I'll eventually get it one of these times, surely. Personally, even when I've replayed this ending multiple times, fully knowing there's no way to stop the bomb, I still can't help myself from fiddling with the knobs and buttons, just in case everyone is wrong and there is a way to stop it. And while every other player doing this ending is panicking, trying to beat it, the narrator is there mocking you for trying to derail his story, mocking you for trying to stop the bomb, but most importantly, he mocks you for not understanding what the game is.
Oh dear me, what's the matter, Stanley? Is it that you have no idea where you're going or what you're supposed to be doing right now? Or did you just assume when you saw that timer that something in this room was capable of turning it off? Why would you think that, Stanley? That this video game can be beaten? Won? Solved? That timer isn't a catalyst to keep the action moving along. It's just seconds ticking away to your death.
He seems to think that he has far more power over you, that you are simply a pawn in his massive big galaxy brain game of chess, and that this ending is just a fluke, that this is one of the rare times he didn't have control over the story, and you mucked it all up by turning the machine back on right at the very end. He even reinforces this idea if you replay the countdown ending again, mocking you for thinking that you could solve this puzzle that he's obviously laid out for you.
How many times will you replay this bit, looking desperately for a solution? 10? 100? 1,000? I look forward to finding out and to watching the bomb go off each time you fail.
It's the true antithesis to the freedom ending. If this were any other video game, you'd deactivate the bomb and still escape, probably just getting a bad ending that's supposed to demoralize the player. Video games utilize good and bad endings to try and coax a player into doing what the writers think is the right thing, usually to try and get some message through to the player, like lessons on morality, responsibility, or in the case of Undertale, genocide is bad, probably. In a typical video game, the freedom ending and the countdown ending would be the climactic final choice between a good and bad ending, but this is no typical video game. So is that it? The countdown ending's only goal is to say how stupid Stanley and the player are, to highlight that the narrator is in control? Well, yes and no. Yes, the narrator does have a good amount of control on where the story can go, but he doesn't realize he has no direct control on what actually happens in the story. Not completely. I've seen some people speculate and talk about how Stanley isn't actually free at the end of the freedom ending because of one line the narrator says towards the end.
This was exactly the way, right now, that things were meant to happen. And Stanley was happy.
People point to this as proof that Stanley isn't and can never be free, because the narrator is still dictating his feelings. I disagree, because the narrator can't control Stanley any more than Stanley can control the narrator. The narrator simply lays out the paths and narrates what's happening on screen, but he can't force you to go anywhere. He can only narrow your options down, and Stanley can choose those options. Sometimes he's only left with one option, sometimes he's only left with obvious options, but it's still his, and by extension, the player's choice to make. Neither of them are fully in control. On your way to the freedom ending, you'll see this passage claiming to be an escape. Once you start walking down it, however, the narrator chimes in that there is no escape that way, just death. Now, depending on what ending you just did before this, or if this is your first chance at an ending, you'll either hesitate and turn back or march onward. Upon reaching the end of the hallway, you're presented one last choice: turn back or drop down. If you choose to drop down the hatch, you're put on a conveyor belt that leads to giant jaws that will kill you while being stuck in some sort of a cage. And as you inch closer to death, the narrator sarcastically mourns your death, reaffirming the idea that Stanley shouldn't be trying to take the story in his own hands.
Stanley can't see the bigger picture. He doesn't know the real story, trapped forever in his narrow vision of what this world is.
However, the moment the jaws are about to crush you, a new narrator chimes in.
"Farewell, Stanley," cried the narrator, as Stanley was led helplessly into the enormous metal jaws. And yet it would be just a few minutes before Stanley would restart the game, back in his office, as alive as ever.
This is the museum ending. The new narrator is never given a name, only referred to as female narrator in the credits. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll be referring to her as Leslie, in reference to her voice actress, Leslie Staples. It's also to allow me to talk about her as her own character for a bit instead of just a different version of the narrator. Leslie pointing out that Stanley would restart the game implies that she's just as knowledgeable as, if not more than, the narrator, as out of the very few characters in the game, only these two seem aware that it is a game, and that Stanley/the player have the ability to restart it whenever they want. The museum itself isn't very symbolic of anything, to me at least. It could be considered an afterlife or a transition from life to an afterlife, but I think this is one of the few moments of the game where it can be taken at face value as just a museum for all of the stuff in the Stanley parable. But since it is a museum for the game itself, we are no longer Stanley when we're inside of it. We know this because of how Leslie comments on Stanley and the narrator and how their dynamic is forever a tug-of-war for control of the story.
Oh, look at these two. How they wish to destroy one another. How they wish to control one another. How they both wish to be free. Can you see how much they need one another? No, perhaps not.
At the end of the museum, you find a switch for the Stanley parable itself. If you go to turn it off, you're taken back to Stanley to a few seconds before the metal jaws go off, and Leslie begs the player, not Stanley, to save them.
But listen to me. You can still save these two. Push escape and press quit. There's no other way to beat this game.
This is how you turn the Stanley parable off. You quit the game. That's how you flip the switch. But we can't just quit the game. We've got to see what happens, right? So Stanley is moved closer to the metal jaws.
Stop now and be your only true choice. Whatever you do, choose it. Don't let time choose for you. Don't let time...
And Stanley dies. This ending is notable for being one of the only endings that you have to manually restart. In almost every other ending, especially the ones where Stanley dies, the game restarts for you. In another ending that we'll get back to in a moment, the narrator even outright tells you that if you die, the game will reset, with or without his control. So what's the difference in the museum ending? In the not Stanley ending, the narrator can't control the story without Stanley. He restarts because of Stanley's inability to continue the story. He didn't restart at the museum ending because, whether he knew it or not, the player was still in control of Stanley and still had a choice to make. As long as there are choices to make, the narrator will not restart. And what is the final choice presented in the museum ending? To quit the game, forfeit control entirely, and leave the narrator and Stanley in peace. Another example of Stanley and the narrator's linked freedom and control is the escape pod ending. This is one of those weird endings you probably wouldn't be able to figure out on your own. To get it, you need to trap the narrator in the boss's office by walking into the office enough to start the door closing animation, but then quickly stepping back out. You even hear the narrator's dialogue getting cut off as the doors finish their closing animation, confirming he is in there without you.
Here's the door.
This lends to the idea that the narrator can't control the story without Stanley, because he can't even open doors without Stanley being present in the same room. Once the narrator is stuck, you can walk all the way back to your office and find door 428 open. This leads to a long set of stairs and a sign saying there's an escape pod on the top floor. After climbing all the stairs right before the escape pod, the player can read a warning saying that both Stanley and the narrator must be present or the ending won't play out as intended. If the warning is ignored and you try to get Stanley to the escape pod, the game restarts itself. This is one of the few instances where something other than the narrator or the player restarts the game. It's important to note. This ending shares some narrative connections to the Countdown ending in that it feels like there should be a solution somewhere, that we're missing some small piece that will allow us to bring the narrator here and escape together. Several players have even come up with their own takes on this ending, adding to it with voice lines that were recorded by Kevin Brighting himself apparently, but they all fail to see something. There already is a complete ending where the narrator and Stanley come together to escape the facility, and that's the freedom ending. Now, am I implying the ending that I called out as being intentionally simple and boring, the real ending to the game? No, not at all. I'm simply reminding people that Occam had a razor, and that this was just a small tangent to poke fun at people who try to say the escape pod ending is weak for just being cut off right before moving on to everyone's favorite ending, the confusion ending. In the confusion ending, an ending where Stanley, the narrator, and the player attempt to find the main story after getting lost, it ends with you finding the confusion ending schedule. A detailed list of events describing what you have done and what you will do, down to how many times the game has been restarted since first getting lost. When the narrator refuses to follow the schedule, the game retaliates by restarting on its own again, although without continuing the rest of the confusion ending as it was scheduled out.
I don't want to be trapped like this. I won't restart the game. I won't do it. I won't do it. I won't do it. And the timer stopped? Does that mean, did we do it? Did we break the cycle? The, whatever it is that made this schedule? How would we even know? Well, in the meantime, if you do happen to have a...
The game has moments similar to this, where one of them tries to take control, and someone ends up worse off in the end. Either the one who lost control, or the one trying to take control. The Not Stanley ending shows a scenario where they both lose control, and it ends poorly for both of them, and it started because of intervention from the player. The ending can only be started by reaching the telephone that would normally lead you to the apartment ending, crouching down and unplugging it. This is a choice that, similar to the beginning of the confusion ending, was not planned at all by the narrator, and it's one Stanley supposedly shouldn't even been able to choose at all.
Now, that wasn't supposed to be a choice. How did you do that? You actually chose incorrectly? I didn't even know that was possible.
Stanley is always being controlled by the player, but in the context of the game, it's always presented as if Stanley is making these choices for that story, and Stanley wouldn't know that unplugging the phone was an option. This ending, the game's ending, and the Zending are all results of Stanley doing a sort of metagaming. Metagaming typically refers to taking action in a role-playing game that would only be taken if your character knew they were, in fact, in a game. Choosing to land on the catwalk or to unplug the phone are choices that the narrator didn't present, and in a normal video game setting, that means they'd be choices you couldn't make. And after unplugging the phone, the game starts to deteriorate, looping in the middle of sentences and becoming unplayable, right up until it boots the player out of Stanley, and we see that Stanley and the narrator can't do anything without the player. This moment shows an equilibrium of sorts between the narrator, Stanley, and the player, and how none of them can actually complete the story on their own. On a surface level, all of these themes and ideas of freedom, choice, and control seem to only service a deconstruction of modern story games. Games that claim to have a vast open world, but are still technically limited in what you can or can't do, and how you'll ultimately still wind up with an ending that most other players also got. But I choose to see it in a more philosophical sense. I think the messages presented here are more than just poking fun at AAA game storytelling. One of the messages that you can take from it is how life can be full of difficult choices that ultimately don't matter in the grand scheme of things, and how you can let these thoughts change how you act, for better or for worse.
I wanted us to be happy here, Stanley. I really did. I still thought that was possible.
I'm going to do that content warning. We're going to talk about some of those topics I first mentioned back in the intro, so again, if you're uncomfortable with listening to any of that, skip to the timestamp on screen right now. Another common theme in the Stanley Parable is the pursuit of happiness, or at the very least, the pursuit of peace of mind. In the Zending, the narrator comes to the realization that neither of them can be happy with all the choices in the game.
Don't you see that it's killing us, Stanley? I want it to stop. We would both be so much happier if we just stopped. And I think I have a solution. Here, let me show you.
He takes you to a room where you just stop and watch the beautiful lights in the sky. The narrator says he thinks everything will be okay if you just stay here. No choices, no story, no ending, just you and him being at peace with one another. but the game can't progress if you stay here. This isn't considered an ending by the game, and with the narrator content to do nothing, it's up to the player to decide how things play out. Remember, the narrator cannot and will not restart if the player has choices to make, even unsavory choices. So what is the choice outside of silently and peacefully sitting here forever? Death. There's a hallway that leads to a concrete room with a flight of stairs and a missing rail at the top. The narrator knows exactly what you're going to do as you're taking the first few steps.
No, wait. Where are you going? Stay away from those stairs. If you die, the game will reset. We'll lose all of this. Please, no, Stanley, let me stay here. Don't take this from me. No! Oh, thank God. No, what are you doing, Stanley? Please, I'm asking you not to take this away from me. I can't go back to what I was before.
While you repeatedly throw yourself from the top of the stairs, the narrator pleads for you to stop, saying that he's finally found happiness and that you can too. Problem with happiness is not everybody will find it the same way. Maybe the narrator found happiness with the Zen room, but not Stanley. Stanley wasn't content with just sitting around doing nothing and wanted to make choices, no matter how unimportant they may be. This ending takes place after jumping off the cargo lift and landing on the catwalk. Given how, if you fall without landing on the catwalk, you get an ending where Stanley dies, I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to interpret this ending as Stanley being hesitant to kill himself. He gave himself an out by aiming for the catwalk. He gave the narrator a chance by going through the red door, hoping the narrator could show him something worth it. But he couldn't convince Stanley in the end. Following on to that, if you instead go on the catwalk and pick the blue door, ignoring the narrator, you get a slightly more light-hearted ending where you explore different video games with the narrator. But on the second game you look at, either Portal or Rocket League, depending on which version of the game you play, it ends similarly to this ending. The narrator content with just letting Stanley sit in an empty room for eternity, and Stanley deciding it's more worth it to jump. It's hard to say if the jump down into the old office was made out of suicidal intent or if it was to simply explore this new area. But considering the other endings you get in the cargo lift area, like the not Stanley ending and the apartment ending, and their more sadder tones, I wouldn't consider the first option to be out of the realm of possibility. I know that in the context of the game, Stanley is being piloted by the player, but in the context of the story being told by Stanley and the narrator, it paints a depressing picture on what Stanley wants. An idea I personally have as to why any ending that involves Stanley stuck somewhere forever ends in death or sadness is because it reminds him of his supposed real life. In the apartment ending, the narrator tells the story of the death of a man named Stanley, detailing how Stanley's life had gone monotonous and stale, and how he fantasized about going on extreme adventures in the office. It's implied that this story could be what's really happening in the Stanley Parable, but just like any other possible explanation for the game's story, it has some holes and is only hypothetical, but that's not what I'm wanting to bring attention to here. In the story, the narrator points out how Stanley was so miserable with his job, he was going to go any length to do anything else. The job, mind you, is sitting in the same office every day and pushing the same buttons over and over. This is why he's discontent with the baby game, or sitting doing nothing in the game's ending. And most of all, that's why he'd push himself to suicide in this ending. Killing yourself to get out of a bad situation is never the right option, but in these scenarios, it's all Stanley had left. Again, stepping back, we're just controlling Stanley and making him jump, but when you refocus on how each ending plays out when written, as if it's a book, it's hard not to make these kind of connections. Now, an idea that I've never really touched up upon, nor one that I think anyone else has brought up, is the idea that Stanley, in the context of the game world, does remember all the restarts, just as the player would. If we take this possibility into account, we're left with two similar but distinct ideas as to the philosophy behind Stanley trying over and over, even if it means dying. The first is, as we've already mentioned, despair. Perhaps Stanley kills himself in these endings because he knows he's never going to escape the parable, not on his own. But to bring up another idea that is just as valid, and to also lighten the mood, some of this could be viewed in a slightly more optimistic light. In the Not Stanley ending, you're presented with an instructional video on making choices. Most of what's said in the video is just there for comedic purposes, but there's one line towards the end of it that I find very insightful, whether it was meant to be or not.
And finally, if you begin to wonder if your choices are actually meaningful and whether you'll ever make a significant contribution to the world, just remember that in the vast infiniteness of space, your thoughts and problems are materially insignificant, and the feeling should subside.
This line, to me, seems like it could be referring to a mindset called optimistic nihilism. Being an internet user, you're probably well versed in what nihilism itself is, but for those in the back who can't hear as well, nihilism is a philosophical mindset in which those who think with that mindset believe that life has no meaning, or to blatantly copy what Merriam-Webster says, a viewpoint that traditional values and beliefs are unfounded and that existence is senseless and useless. It's a belief that is typically linked to feelings of depression and hopelessness, that possibly fake children's book everyone was making fun of on Twitter a bit ago being a good example of nihilism. Life is meaningless, why bother? That's the nihilistic mantra. Optimistic nihilism, on the other hand, spins it in a different way. If life really has no meaning, if we're all just put on this planet with no purpose, then what's stopping you from giving it your own purpose? What's stopping you from enjoying the stuff you love? Well, you can. If it really doesn't matter in the end, and it's all gonna be gone when the sun explodes or when the universe burns away, why not take your time? That's the general idea of optimistic nihilism, and it's an idea that the Stanley Parable seems to encourage in multiple endings. The narrator thinks that freeing them from the mind control facility, doing the same things over and over, or being stuck in one place at peace are all means to find true happiness, and they very well might be, but they aren't inherently optimistic viewpoints. Freedom is overall too subjective, and going off of how unspecific the freedom ending is, we have no way to discern if Stanley is even happy by the end. Doing stuff over and over is too repetitive, and staying in one spot forever seems somewhat depressing. Stanley choosing to take the story for his own, to try and find happiness elsewhere, even at the cost of his own life, is seen as sad and pointless to the narrator because he thinks it won't matter if the game resets. The game resetting back to 1 is the end of the world to the narrator, because unlike Stanley and the player, he doesn't fully remember everything that happens in previous playthroughs, and thinks that when it's over, it's really over. This is a pessimistic nihilism viewpoint, the one we're also more familiar with. This is why he shows no remorse on endings like the Cold Feet and Powerful endings, the two endings where Stanley can die if you fall to the warehouse floor. To him, Stanley dying here wasn't a major loss, as the story just wasn't there in either of them. He accepted the game was going to reset a lot easier here because of how little was sunk into it at that point. In the Countdown ending, he's also content with the world coming to an end around him because he's just not happy with the story you've left him with. In the cases where the story is unsatisfactory, he seems to be alright with letting it all come to an end and resetting. He'd rather the world burn around him than live with the mess you've made. But there are a few key times where he doesn't want it to end, where he thinks he's found what he's looking for. He feels sad on the endings like the Zending because he believes a story about two friends finding peace in their own company is a good one that doesn't need to end. The Zending is interesting because it shows the narrator growing as a person and coming to regret the things that he's done. This also somewhat goes in line with the Apartment ending, where he at first seems delighted in the chance to torture Stanley and put him in his place, making fun of Stanley for thinking he has a loving wife, for having a boring job, and for needing to fantasize everything just to keep moving. But as the ending progresses, he seems less and less happy about it, and pity creeps into his dialogue. We see he's more than willing to screw with Stanley by activating a bomb when his story is tainted last minute, but he seems to be far more sympathetic in the Apartment ending. Some may see this as him putting on a show for the player, as he is good at doing that, but this sadness feels different. It feels like he's actually showing it for Stanley, genuinely. I think this is the moment the narrator truly does feel for Stanley's desire to make his own story, and has grown to be more understanding. He doesn't want to just tell a story, he wants Stanley to be happy in that story. But by this point, it's too late. Stanley's fallen back into his sadness by accepting that all he ever does is push buttons. The game's going to restart soon. The narrator knows this, but he'll still keep trying to help Stanley.
And I tried again, and Stanley pushed a button. And I tried again, and Stanley pushed a button. And I tried again, and Stanley pushed a button.
And I do think it's reassuring that the narrator comes to this conclusion, even if it does take the figurative end of the world for him to get there. Maybe it means he can come to it again, before it's too late.
Okay then, it's an adventure. Come, Stanley, let's find the story.
By this point in the video, I want to make it clear that not everything I say is going to apply to every part of the Stanley Parable. Some of it's going to contradict itself, and some of it is stuff I'm only partially confident in. The first two parts of this video were about the endings that I could mostly group together under the themes of freedom and happiness, though loosely. These themes aren't mutually exclusive or anything, I just grouped them like this because it's practically impossible to come up with one single narrative or idea that 100% encompasses all of the game. It's a tightly wrapped ball of a bunch of different ideologies all coexisting. And as such, there were a few endings I couldn't really fit into these two broader themes, or some endings that I wasn't entirely sure on the meaning of. So let's go through them now. First, let's get this out of the way. No, the broom closet ending doesn't have any deep meaning behind it. Don't get me wrong, it's still a fantastic joke, and I still consider it to be one of the best, if not the absolute best endings from the original game, but it's there as a gag. At best, it reinforces the idea that the narrator can't control everything no matter how hard he tries, and at worst, it's a moment for Stanley to spite the narrator without any big consequences, and I'm all for it. The Mariella ending feels like it's another red herring attempt to trick the player as to what's going on in the Stanley Parable. It's a very obvious, and in that regards very boring, answer to the whole mystery of it all. Stanley is just dreaming, or insane, or both. Please, that's as bad as thinking the narrator is just a tape recorder. It's such an obvious red herring that if MatPat were to ever do a game theory on Stanley Parable, I can guarantee you he'd latch onto this ending as the basis, and it'd be hilarious. It is interesting to see an ending that breaks the fourth wall in a different way, of having the narrator talk in Stanley's first-person view, and Stanley actively acknowledging the narrator in the context of his own world. But this is all coming from the narrator himself, so it's hard to say. I will say this. Mariella is a bitch for not calling an ambulance immediately. Like, what the fuck? Why would you stop and stare at a man who just collapsed on the sidewalk and start thinking to yourself, oh wow, I sure am lucky to be completely sane and not lying face down on the concrete? Fuck you, Mariella. As of writing this part of the script, this is the one and only ending I haven't experienced myself. That's because it solely consists of pressing one button for 2 hours, then 2 buttons for another 2 hours. But 2 things to take away from this ending is that A, it's very clearly an attempt from the narrator to mock Stanley by turning his boring job of pushing buttons into a game, and B, the narrator seems to think the baby game has some deep, grand message and meaning behind it. Either he's being sarcastic for Stanley's sake, or this is a meta-commentary on idiots like me who are trying to find a deeper meaning in the Stanley Parable as a whole. Joke's on them, since I haven't played this ending, the commentary falls deaf upon my sinful ears. This is Stanley at his most pathetic and sad. So scared of the choices ahead of him, he doesn't even bother to leave his office. A better fate than what happens in some of the other endings, but not an interesting story. Basically the same as the endings where Stanley dies, but minus the introspective elements. I don't know what to say about this one. Like actually. To say it's confusing would be obvious and redundant. The narrator losing track of the story is genius in its simplicity, the office slowly changing with each reset is somewhat suspenseful on your first playthrough, and it makes you paranoid as to when it's actually going to be over. The line is a wonderful allegory for unhelpful guide characters in video games. The fern. Just the fern. I can't tell if it's supposed to be more clever deconstruction, a meta commentary on the game itself, or a massive shitpost. Maybe it's all three. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. I genuinely am not sure. It just makes very little sense, so with that in mind, my goodness, is it 4:30? I'm supposed to be having a back sack and crack. Alright, that's all the endings from the original game that I wanted to talk about. I didn't bother with the whiteboard, serious, heaven, or out of bounds endings because they all fall somewhere between complete nonsense or really good gags. The Stanley Parable would go on to be pretty well received by critics and gamers, but there were a number of reviews from around that time that seemed to not quite get what the game was going for, either thinking there should have been more gameplay or just thinking the game's messages were at surface level is just decisions are useless and the only thing for certain is death, or that it could have been funnier or faster paced. There were reviewers saying they were bored by the lack of choices and the unsolvable mystery of it all, and I look at these reviews and think, how can you be so close to getting what this game's about, but still fall just short? Just so close. You're almost there. So when it came time for a new game to be made, a remake for consoles with new content, what better an idea than to directly confront these kinds of criticisms in the same way they confronted the tropes of first-person story-driven adventure games, with an immense amount of charm, sarcasm, and existential dread.
Oh, new content? What does that mean, new content?
Right out the gate, the game makes it unclear if Ultra Deluxe is a sequel or a remake, so I'm here to answer, and it's both, I think. Ultra Deluxe is interesting because it has the entirety of the original Stanley Parable as a base, but just adds on to it. New endings, new rooms, new narration, and most importantly, new themes. If the original game's mission was to deconstruct and lampoon narrative story games as a whole, then this one's main mission is to deconstruct game criticism. and to tackle the idea of leaving behind a legacy, and to deconstruct the original game, and to talk about why leaving a legacy isn't important, and Gambarada. Look, it's an understatement to say that Ultra Deluxe goes for more broader ideas in the original game, so let's take it one step at a time and ask a question. How do you even make a sequel to the Stanley Parable? Well, it's simple. You add a jump circle. The first new content ending serves as a tongue-in-cheek response to people who wanted new game mechanics or narration in the original game. The narrator himself even complains about the lack of anything significant.
You've got to be kidding me. You see, Stanley? This is what happens when greedy video game developers with no respect for their fanbase rush a cheap expansion to market for no reason other than to make an easy dollar.
Also, yeah, the narrator. He is quite different in terms of what he knows about the game and story. Remember all those questions and the mystery in the first part of this video regarding how much the narrator is in control, or how much he's actually aware of the inner workings of this game? Well, the beginning parts of Ultra Deluxe seem to mostly sweep all of that out of the way, as the narrator implies that he knew everything that was going on in the original game. He was always in control, and that he made it, or at least had a sizable hand in making it, so he could tell his story. We know this from the Memory Zone, where he looks at reviews from the game, indulging himself in the positive reviews and using it as a chance to take a stab at the shoddy work of the remake. We get even more insight when he looks at the pressurized gas reviews that complained about the game being unfunny and boring, to which the narrator responds with,
Unfunny? I'm not trying to be funny. I'm trying to make a serious work of art.
Which is simultaneously the funniest and most relatable line in all of Ultra Deluxe in terms of response to the original game, and it perfectly highlights a problem with how people went into the original game at the time. They remembered endings like the Confusion ending and the Broom Closet ending because they were really funny, but not nearly as many people would positively recount the Not Stanley ending or the Zending. Either because they don't want to acknowledge the dread lying just beneath the surface of those endings, or because they never noticed it in the first place. But now the narrator is taking in all of the negative feedback. The reviewer is saying the narration is too slow, there's not enough gameplay, and he bends to them. He adds a skip button. Now, remember how I said the narrator can't control everything that happens without Stanley, even when it's retroactively implied he had full control in the original game, or how he can't restart if there's still choices for the player to make? Well, those rules still seem to apply to Ultra Deluxe, and here we see a more desolate version of the Not Stanley ending. Because the skip button makes it so the player can't control Stanley while it's skipping, from our point of view, the skip is just a couple of seconds, but since the button is meant to skip past the narrator's long-winded dialogue, when we press the button, he's waiting for us. At first, it's only a couple minutes long, just to let him get through his dialogue and then wait for us to catch up. But for some unexplained reason, the skips keep getting longer, from 30 minutes to 12 hours, and the narrator is becoming more and more desperate. He can't make a new door out, he can't present any choices, and worst of all, since there's still the player's choice of pushing the button or not, he can't restart the game. All he can do is wait. And as we've seen with the Not Stanley ending, the narrator is completely miserable when left alone, as anyone would be. By the 5th skip, he's already accepting the fact you'll push the button, and after a while sits in dreaded silence knowing he's going to be alone again. Once we get to the 6th skip, he presents a simple question.
Oh, hello, it's you. I have had time to think about you and about us and about everything we've been through. I've had so much time, I stopped keeping track after a year. Have you ever sat down in one place and not moved for one entire year?
Being social is a part of human nature. Just about everyone has the fear of being left completely isolated for any extended amount of time. Even the most antisocial among us would have difficulty saying exactly how long they could handle themselves mentally if left completely to their own devices for about a week or two, let alone 1 year. Studies have even shown that complete isolation, if only for just a few hours, can lead to warped perceptions of reality, time, anxiety, and hallucinations. We know from the Zending that the narrator isn't completely devoid of emotions outside of spite and sarcasm, and we also know that he is susceptible to pressure as per the negative reviews bothering him so much. So to say that a year without any kind of interaction with the player, Stanley, or any other character within the parable would affect him negatively is an understatement. He talks about the regret he felt of not taking the opportunities given to him, whether this is in reference to the moments of connection he felt with Stanley or something else is unknown. But after stewing in these regrets for the longest of times, he came to the revelation that it doesn't matter. None of it did. What he did in the past, what will happen, because there is no free will in this world, not as long as he is stuck waiting for you to skip past everything he has to say.
I have been waiting for you. Not that you might save me or do something to fix it, but merely to state for you the plain fact of this manner of existence. I wish you to feel afraid as I do. Perhaps you will somehow, in some way, have to live as I do now, and I wish for you to know how excruciating it is. Perhaps it will bring me the smallest moment of peace in the darkness.
This might just be the darkest moment for the narrator. At no point in the original game has he wished such an excruciatingly terrible fate to Stanley. Every other time that he's belittled Stanley or wished ill will upon him, it was usually towards the end of that respective story, and he knew full well the game would restart soon, making it all trivial. He's gone from pessimistic nihilism to full-on desolation. He's lost it all. Or so he says, until a couple of skips later.
But they didn't understand the game was never meant to be funny. It was meant to have a point. It was meant to speak to the human condition. But where are the jokes? Where are the jokes? They bemoaned, they screamed, they gnashed their teeth and said, entertain us.
It's truly incredible and saddening to see that despite the immense amount of time that he's been stuck here alone, despite the fact he supposedly accepted his place in the universe and was just waiting for it all to end, the negative reviews have left such a bitter aftertaste in his mind that he no longer wishes to do anything but defend his story. As a creator, he wants nothing but to justify his creation to the world. He spent time, resources, and energy into making the Stanley Parable. He just wanted people to enjoy it. And the thing is, lots of people did enjoy it. Back at the reviews area, there were plenty of positive reviews left by people who did enjoy the game, but they were all blurred out. He was so fixated on defending his work from the negative ones that he metaphorically and, well, physically, couldn't read the positive ones. After skipping a couple more times, we find him broken, repeating the tagline of the Stanley Parable series over and over, so he can no longer comprehend how long he's been stuck there with his own thoughts. In my original video talking about the game, I was unsure if the narrator had somehow escaped or if he was just silent forever after this point, but now looking back on the storyline again, I think it's more obvious that this is the one time the narrator died instead of Stanley. The narrator is treated as an antagonist for so many of the endings that this one ending truly humanizes him in a way that no other part of the game does. Once again, Stanley and the player still have a choice. Wait like the narrator did, or continue to skip ahead. So they continue. Eventually, after an unfathomable amount of time has passed from skipping, the skip button room is in shambles with an entire chunk of the corner gone. Stepping out, we see nothing. What would there be? The narrator is gone. He can't give you any more choices. It's a very somber and quiet ending, one of melancholic reflection. Stanley is free without the narrator, but at what cost? This is when the game decides you've seen enough and restarts you on its own. For the sake of brevity on the video, I couldn't show everything the narrator says during the skip button ending, but trust me when I say it's a devastating blow to the player, especially as one of the first parts of the new game. So what better way to deal with confused existentialism than to give the player tonal whiplash by immediately having them go through a new storyline full of charming gags? Hooray for ignoring existential dread! Okay, so look, comedy is subjective. What you find funny, I don't find funny because I'm intellectually superior to you, yada yada, who cares? These games are absolutely hilarious. This isn't to undermine the serious stuff either, because as much as I love the introspective, philosophical, big brain bits of the game that makes me feel stuff, the game would not work nearly as well if it had zero levity to it. It's the idea that when playing this for the first time, you have no idea when you're going to be hit with the smartest recontextualization of video game tropes, or the silliest of gags since SpongeBob throwing that fire extinguisher. So keeping that in mind, the Stanley Parable 2 Expo Hall is both really funny and really smart when given the context of the skip button ending. The negative reviews repeatedly called the game unfunny, so the narrator responds by making a sequel that is entirely filled with gags. Amazing gags, mind you, like the bucket, new office balloons, and the infinite hole, but these alone can't make a good game. As much as a game comprised solely of thought-provoking messages and no sense of humor doesn't do it for me, neither does a game that is only trying to be funny with no connective tissue or main idea to spring these jokes off of. The narrator doesn't realize this at first because he's so focused on trying to fix the Stanley Parable based on the comments and the reviews. When he does realize that gags alone a sequel won't make, he doesn't want to get rid of them. They're all great. But he needs more than gags for a sequel, wants to appease reviewers by making the story funnier, and wants to keep the gags he's already made. So he kills 3 birds with 1 stone by just taking the original game, adding a couple of new endings, and carefully inserting the gags at different points into it. And most of these new endings are just there for the sake of poking fun at the original game and the people who played it. In the original game, there was a glitch where you could fall off of a platform in the mind control facility section and get stuck. So in this game, it's a new ending where you get sung a funny song.
3, 2, 1. Good job, you made it to the bottom of the mind control facility.
There's an ending where you enter a secluded vent and find the narrator's voice lines playing on a tape recorder. Then you get double-tricked by the narrator, revealing it to be another gag at the expense of players trying to find fodder for theory videos.
You didn't think I was actually just a recording, did you? What a silly and trite explanation that would be. It was all just in Stanley's head. I bet that's the kind of twist you think is revelatory.
And let's not forget the bucket endings. Almost every ending that was made for the original game has been changed in one way or another if you're carrying the bucket when you do them. These can be minor changes like different narration and slightly different events, to full-on new rooms and ideas. I'm gonna level with you, as weird as it is to use this term for a game like this, none of the bucket endings are really canon. That's to say, none of them really have a deep message to them. They're all just lampooning the original game in some way or another, either by telling such nonsensical jokes that they try to come off as profound, or by being confusing for confusion's sake, with things like the evil wizard Gambarata being alluded to in a few areas, hinting at some bigger picture we never even get a glance at, all to toy with the players who didn't understand the original game. Think about it. You've just finished the original Stanley Parable, and now you're moving on to its pseudo-sequel. You discover that there's a bucket that changes parts of the narration, so now you spend your entire playtime trying every ending to see if you can find something new with the bucket. Maybe the escape pod ending works now. Nope, you just put the bucket in the escape pod. Maybe the rest of the confusion ending plays out. Nope, instead you attempt to destroy the bucket, to no avail. Well, maybe the freedom ending is less ambiguous and is finally confirmed to be the true ending or not. Oh, look at that, it's another no! It's an elaborate and brilliant way to have double the amount of endings from the original game, while still keeping it true to the Stanley Parable by always having the players second guessing. And despite none of the bucket endings having any deeper meaning to just be funny, I'm going to follow the advice and instructions of my personal favorite bucket ending to show that they aren't useless. As you know, in the Not Stanley ending, you're presented with an instructional video on how to make correct choices in life, but if you're holding the bucket when you unplug the phone, you instead get an instructional video on perfecting comedic timing. So now, without further ado, I am going to follow its directions to the letter by telling you a simple joke with correct comedic timing. Ahem! First off, you're going to need to pretend we're standing 50 to 80 centimeters apart, that the air is a nice 76 degrees Fahrenheit, and that my arm is raised at a 15-degree angle from my body. These are the optimal conditions for good comedic timing, and ones I cannot fully express over video. To begin with, my name is Stupid Wizard, Stupidwizard, but some people call me Wiz, W-I-Z. The joke I'm about to tell you consists of 3 objects and/or characters. Those objects and/or characters being myself, as I tell the joke from the first-person perspective, a second unnamed character, I call it a man, but you could swap him out for any other sapient creature that has a head to get similar results, and a bucket. I chose a joke that involves a bucket to keep it tonally in line with this segment of the video. The joke is about me running into a man with a bucket on his head, the humor at first being derived from that outlandish situation. I then ask him what he is doing with a bucket on his head. He responds with, "I always wear a bucket on my head on Monday," with more humor being derived from yet another outlandish statement. To punctuate this weird predicament, I respond by asking if he is aware that today is actually Tuesday and not Monday, to which the man concludes the joke by blushing and saying, "Oh no, I must look like such an idiot." The last bit of ironic joy coming from him not being embarrassed about the bucket on his head, but in the fact that he got the days mixed up on when he should be wearing the bucket on his head. During the course of the joke, you will laugh no less than 2 times and no more than 5 times. Potential laughing points in the joke are when I initially bring up the bucket on his head, ask him what he's doing, possibly at the point where I correct him on the day, and one final laugh should be had at the end when I finish saying the word idiot. And now, before I begin the joke, I must reintroduce myself. I am Stupid Wizard, Stupidwizard, but again, some people call me Wiz, W-I-Z. Now I will tell the joke in its entirety, taking no more than 18 seconds, but no less than 13 and a half, pausing for potential laugh spots if necessary, seeing as I will not be needing the bathroom during the remainder of this joke. I saw a man with a bucket on his head. When I asked what he was doing, he explained, "I always wear a bucket on my head on Monday." "But today is Tuesday," I asked. He blushed. Oh no, I must look like such an idiot. And as customary, I will finish the joke by saying, I'm Dunny with the funny. Now I would like to direct your attention to the description of the video where a link to a 10-page survey on the joke I just told you will be. Please answer the entirety of the survey before ceasing your laughter and make sure to pay attention as there will be repeated questions to make sure you understood the joke properly. I don't know if any of that made the joke funnier or not, but I did it anyways. Let's continue and never acknowledge this section of the video again. So yeah, since almost every new ending that involves the bucket has the main objective of being funny, I think it passes with flying colors. So you may be thinking something along the lines of, is that it? Just one new ending that's really deep and the rest is a bunch of gags? Well, no, because again, I think having the new stuff mostly be lighthearted funny stuff works so well because of its contrast with the deeper messages present here, and also there's more than one deep ending here. During the Stanley Parable 2 Expo, there's an area cornered off for an epilogue of some sorts. At the time, the narrator doesn't know what ending it's going to be put after, but that we can figure it out later. After collecting all the Stanley figurines, another new addition that seems to just be a gag at first, we're taken to the memory zone again, where the narrator wants to relive the memories of finding all of them. If it wasn't obvious from the new content and skip button ending, the narrator is really focused on trying to relive the past as much as he can this time around. In those endings, he insists the game wasn't in need of a remake, and that the developers ruined his perfect story. He changes his mind after seeing all the reviews and implements new features like the Stanley figurines, which he dismisses at first as just a gag meant to distract the player, but he slowly finds himself more and more interested. And then, once you've gone through the memory zone and recollected all the figurines, the narrator starts to restart the game again, but realizes he doesn't want to stop reminiscing yet.
No, I'm not done. I'm not ready to move on. Stop the loading screen. Let's just go backwards. We'll do the memory zone again from the opposite direction. See how that feels.
And after going through all the figurines again, you reach earlier parts of the game, with the jump circle, the 2 doors, and finally ending up in Stanley's office.
Is there anything else? Was there something that came before your office? There's something I feel I can remember. I can remember. Yes, I'm remembering something now.
He remembers a different time. A time when he made the decisions himself. A time before his invention of Stanley. He bemoans the fact that he had gone lazy and made Stanley to make decisions for him. He would cheer him on and tell a story. He recognizes that Stanley was made because of how lonely he felt, and that as good of a companion Stanley made for himself and the story, he thinks Stanley has just about ran his course. It's just about time to retire the parable entirely and go back to how he was before.
Yes, I can be on my own again. I can do it. I'll be stronger this time. I'll take care of myself. I don't need Stanley anymore. Oh, but he truly was so much fun to play with. You know what? Since we're in the memory zone, how about one more good memory? Let's go back just once and give Stanley one more run of the office, and then I'll retire him for good. I did enjoy telling his story so very much. Okay, here we go. This is the story of a man named Stanley.
And now the epilogue is available to play. Before we get into the epilogue, I want to quickly go back onto something from way earlier in the game that will provide some context I didn't bring up until now because it was important. When you boot up Ultra Deluxe for the first time, you're greeted by this text. Despite appearing to be just a settings screen, this is actually a character. This is the settings person, or employee number 432, as confirmed by Davey Redden in a live stream. He appears multiple times whenever you open the game, asking for the correct time among other settings. At first, it seems like another one of the game's gags, asking for the time again and again, and throwing in new settings, like how close the dog and the cat should be, and which of these made-up words is more appealing. But he slowly becomes more thoughtful with each game start, pointing out how you're still strangers despite all the information you've given, asking if you really are setting the real time, and finally asking if you would come back and visit him when the time came. His job is done. He's changed all the settings for you, and you still don't know him, and he still doesn't know you. But he'll get one more setting right for you. He'll just be waiting for you to find him. The epilogue takes place right after the events of the skip button ending. The narrator is still gone, Stanley and the player are still trying to find anything. After wandering the wasteland for a while, you come across the remains of the memory zone. Inside, you find mixed reviews on the Stanley Parable 2, complaining about the game's lack of new content and how disappointing the new gags are. except for the bucket, which is usually praised. There's also a press release from the developers stating that there would be no more sequels or spin-offs to the Stanley Parable after its disastrous launch. In some of the rooms are a bunch of gym buttons. In the Stanley Parable 2 Expo, the narrator unveils a new feature, a button that will say the name of the player currently playing, but it's broken as of right now and only says the name Jim.
Jim.
Pressing them in the epilogue has the same effect. They all say Jim, except for one.
Jim. Stanley.
There's one button that says Stanley.
Stanley.
Given the reviews being put in here, the random office memorabilia, and the buttons, I think it wouldn't be out of the question to say this was all put here by the narrator. Whether that's because the memory zone is a manifestation of his thoughts and we're walking through the disheveled remains, or because he somehow got out of the skip button room where we were skipping is unclear. What is clear is that sometime, somehow, between all the regretting, the denial, and the insanity that ensued because of his loneliness, the narrator still made this button. The buttons were made because the narrator wanted each player to feel individually recognized and validated. He made the Stanley button to make Stanley feel recognized and validated, even when Stanley was out of his reach. It really is poetic that every time the narrator realizes just how much he needs Stanley, they're no longer able to be together. At the end of the memory zone, you find employee number 432's desk, and on the computer you can talk to him again. He's completely flabbergasted at the thought of no new Stanley Parable content, saying the game isn't sacred, we don't need to preserve or protect it. He thinks that we should keep making new Stanley Parable games until the sun explodes, to drag it through the mud and back. He highlights why this was the narrator's problem, his obsession with how everyone else viewed his work. Don't make his mistake, don't cling to the legacy, let it burn. He then helps you to make Stanley Parable 3, saying that all you need to do is change the number on the title screen and come up with a new subtitle. If you go through with it, from this point on, every time you open the game again, the number goes up by 1 and you're prompted to put in a new subtitle, and nothing else in the game will ever change. No new endings, no new narrations, just the same game over and over. It's the continued message of the sequel, to just enjoy things while you can. Stop worrying about a reward, stop worrying about what others will think, and most importantly, stop worrying about what comes next. It doesn't matter what happens next as long as you have fun. He does leave you with a parting gift by fixing the broken achievement the narrator commented on earlier in the game, and with all of that done, he asks you one last time to set the correct time. Once back in the office, you're given the opportunity to replay the new content ending with the bucket, in which the narrator becomes confused.
Wait, Stanley. I've just now realized. That bucket you're holding, it's the bucket I've been working on for my sequel. How did you get your hands on it? Wait, if you're still carrying the bucket around with you, if the bucket is interesting to you, that means I must have made it correctly. I did it! I win! I made a sequel to the Stanley Parable! Yes, the sign is correct. Thank you for enjoying the new content. Thank you for enjoying the new content. I win.
I know I played that dialogue at the end of the previous Stanley Parable video, but it's a very happy moment. The narrator did what he set out to do. Make a good sequel to the Stanley Parable, and what a good sequel it is. There's still so much I could go over with these games. What ending could be the true ending? The significance of employee number 432? Are there more secrets beyond the numbered sequels? But I think I've done everything I set out to do. I've talked about everything I wanted to with these games, and the best part is the infinite ways you can interpret them. They're thought-provoking and thoughtless, happy and sad, simple and confusing. You play a Stanley and you don't play a Stanley. You will follow a story, you will make your own story. You will always have a choice. A lot of players seem to be going into these games expecting a fully fleshed out gameplay menagerie and an easy to understand story. We're so focused on trying to find the game that the messages and ideas presented by Davey Redden and his crew were left unseen. This game wasn't meant to be beaten. It's not meant to be solved. Hell, you could argue it wasn't even meant to be dissected to the degree that I'm doing today in this video. It was meant to be enjoyed and experienced for what it is. A story about Stanley. Because deep down, we're all Stanley. We've all had times in our life of monotonous boredom, wishing for more. We've all experienced confusion, sadness, a lack of control. We've all wanted to tell our own story, in our own way. And I think the biggest takeaway from the Stanley Parable is its main gameplay. To keep moving forward and opening doors. Sure, you might run into similar situations over and over again, but nothing's gonna happen if you just sit around feeling sorry for yourself. So what was the game meant for? The game was meant to be enjoyed. And I sure did enjoy it. Well, that about does it. I still have another page or two of script, so I guess it's time for the bi-monthly channel lore. And you know what? I'm tired of the void. It was a fun gag for a little while, but I'm ready to move on. Besides, every scene in here looks like it's a PowerPoint presentation. I think it's time we take these videos somewhere new with a little more character to it and slightly better visuals. Let me see what I can do. Shia Kazing! There we go. Alright, we got 3 walls, a 4th wall I can break occasionally, a ceiling, nice, nice. A background that has a few bits and bobs to give it some semblance of character, probably gonna change over time. Now to decide on the next video while simultaneously possibly hinting at future videos. Let her rip. Yeah, about time I did another one of those, especially since I promised one at 500 subs and kind of forgot about it. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Subscribe, comment, whatever. I'm tired, you're not. Bye.